So, welcome back to Discussion Day. Hooray! Do any of you guys watch John Oliver? Probably not. I'm guessing not. He's this comedian actor who does a show called The Last Week Tonight with John Oliver on HBO, and I think it's hilarious. And it usually talks about whatever's happened in the news for the past week, and then also does a deep dive onto some topic like how vaccines are produced or political justice in America, stuff like that. But I always think of it when we are doing these Zooms now, because since the pandemic, he's been recording the show like in a white room in his house somewhere in New York City because he can't leave to go to the office. And so every time I check in this room, I'm always like, I'm at John Oliver's white room of nothingness, all alone. Cracks me up. Anyhow, that was my side topic for the day. Today we are. Hi, Josh. You're on mute, but I think you were going to say something.
Oh no, yeah, no, I just wanted to I don't know if I'm thinking of someone else. Is John Oliver like the British talk show host? Is that the one? Because I don't know if that was someone. Oh, okay, I see.
Have you seen it?
No, I've heard of him, and I think I've seen a couple videos, but I didn't know if you were specifically talking about John Oliver because it sounded like what he would do. But yeah, no, I just wanted to clarify.
Like the end of last season, he built this giant 4-story high set of the numbers 2020 and then blew it up. News show. It's pretty great.
What is his name?
John Oliver.
John Oliver. Oh yeah, I've seen this, but I don't watch it every day. But my friend does, and I saw it.
I love it. I'm surprised I haven't stuck in. I think I probably will. I think when we get to something, I don't know, I'll try and put one of his deep dives in as a historical, so we can laugh at the same time, right? So laughter necessary for this week because it was I think this is the first week you guys really, correct me if I'm wrong. The last time I taught this class, let me just explain why I'm sometimes confused. The last time I taught this class was in the summer, and so everybody did 3 weeks at a time. Oh, if you can imagine. It's a lot of reading.
Only 3 weeks for summer?
Yeah, in the summer semester, because it's only 6 weeks instead of 17. So you guys would do 3 modules each week in the summer.
That's intense.
It's intense. Yeah. So that's why I'm always like, did you do this week or last week? Because in my mind, I still am thinking of the 6-week version. But that's okay, because they're all connected. So this week you saw some actual footage of some minstrelsy performances, and I just want to start out with that and making some space in case anybody wants to talk about how that made you feel, if it made you feel anything at all, if it made you feel shock, or because we're going to see some more, it's going to get more intense next week, but I just wanted to open the floor and make room for that, if that makes sense.
About reading, was this week reading?
Like watching the minstrelsy. So watching White Minstrelsy, I should say. So although both can be very uncomfortable to watch. So talking about when people in vaudeville, white people had stolen dances from the African community and then were basically parodying them and putting on blackface and performing. And this went on for a long time. It was like the first big entertainment fad in America. And of course, the white people were allowed to parody the Black people in America, but the Black people were not allowed to parody anybody else because of the way that the social structures worked.
Actually, the school that I went to, it's in Michigan. It's called Interlochen Center for the Arts, and they have an Instagram, and they posted similar to what you're saying. and then like some people got like really sensitive and they couldn't explain like what it is. And I think that's what you're talking about. And then they like apologized and said, oh, I think it's like a white man um, making himself like a black man dancing or
Mhm.
so. Yeah, I think that's what you say, because they couldn't explain. I think they got that picture from like their old shows, and then they put it on Instagram as like a historical moment or something. And yeah, I think that's
It didn't go over very well, right? Yeah. So it's I always think it's interesting to talk about blackface and to like just pause and let there be silence in the room, because when we're watching these super old videos, let me pop up a little share screen for a moment. Just because I like to pop back and forth. Boink. So here on our class page, we're here on 6B. Next week is when we really get deep into minstrelsy. But if you were watching, especially this, not so much the PG Lowry, where's the one I was talking about? It's the next page. Nope, 2 more pages. We're going to talk all about Brendan Dixon Gottschild next. And we're just going to spend some time with that and like break down those ideas. That's most of our day to day. Group dances, yay, fun. Social dances. It's the last page. Here we go. No, it's not even that page. Come on now, Amber. I thought I had pulled it up for you. Here.
Is it the clip from the I forgot what the movie was called, or yeah.
This one is the one where we first started to see some of the blackface minstrelsy, and this history in here. So if you are scanning through things, I definitely recommend hanging in there for the first half of this video here. But it's going to show you, is that even? Could I be cool enough to have it? So I think this is a reenactment, obviously.
You'll be around here about a half hour before the show. You mean you can let me watch up close? Jim Crow, you'll practically be right on the stage. Woo! Wheel about, turn about, change that. Wheel about and turn about and you just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. Give me back my clothes, please.
So like this is a film about the original Mr. Rice who stole Jim Crow's dance. And so this is the story that we know to be true about where blackface minstrelsy started, which is basically that this vaudeville performer saw a man dancing on the street who was working on the docks and called him back, and then took his clothes and his jants and went onto the vaudeville stage and performed, leaving the black man naked backstage, begging to get his clothes back so that he could get to his job on time, because he was actually a dock worker. And it's interesting that even in this this film, which off the top of my head, I don't know what year this was, the depiction right here of the original Jim Crow man, even that depiction is really pretty racist, right? They're presenting him as having ginormous eyes. Look how the actor is like opening his eyes really big and pouting his lips out really big and exaggerating his Southern accent. So all of those things are ways in which Black people in America were stereotyped through minstrelsy. And even though this is later, this is probably the early part of the 1900s when this film is made, those echoes of how we racially stereotype Black people are still quite apparent. Even though showing this story, I'm sure the movie thought it was being kind of advanced in demonstrating the unfairness to Jim Crow of stealing his craft, but it's still at the same time racist. And I think that is part of what Ika was saying about what happened in Michigan, where the college Instagram shared an old performance that they thought like, oh, maybe they thought, oh, we wouldn't do blackface anymore, but this was a party or a show we had in the past, and people were upset about resharing that photo, because even when we're resharing, it's still a giant mess and it's still offensive. And that's part of why I wanted to like pause at the beginning this topic and leave space for that, because here we are in 2021 and we have this thing going on. Well, so I first taught this class in 2020. So we were doing the Whiteface Minstrelsy section during Black Lives Matter protests all across America, which was really intense. And I was grateful for it, because I felt as a white teacher that this was a great way for me to try and do the uncomfortable work that we need to do as a nation to accept our past, acknowledge it, and do better in the future. But that said, it's not easy to go through. So I just want to acknowledge that and make room for people to be upset. And I think a lot of the time when we are people of privilege, we assume, just like this film is assuming, sort of assume that it's not a big deal anymore, or we wouldn't do that anymore, or we wouldn't make that mistake. And that assumption that we're doing better is what it is our job now in 2021 to do better at. Like, my assumption is that I'm going to mess it up, and that I need people who are not of the same privilege of me to help me to understand how to do it even better. That said, is there anything else that you guys want to add about this? I don't know. I do want to also say that if you are ever watching some of the imagery or some of the films in this section and it gets to be too much for you, it's okay to like take a pause and take a break. And if that means you can't watch all of it right now, like just check in with me, because that's valid. And as Ika said, her college had an issue. Like, we had an issue at Skyline College a couple of years ago where someone thought that they were doing an acting presentation and it was absolutely inappropriate, and the teacher didn't know how to call it out, and it exploded. So these things happen for reals still today, which I think 2 years ago we wouldn't necessarily have all been able to acknowledge, but hopefully since 2020 it's a little bit more apparent that the work is there to do. So that's my long version. Yes, that's exactly right. They're trying to make Black people look stupid in the chat box I'm reading here. And why is that? Why do you think white people would want to make Black people look stupid? Especially 200 years ago, especially 100 years ago, and still same reason today.
Or I don't know, was that like a rhetorical question, or was that like an
No, please. Why
Oh,
would one group want to make another group look stupid?
oh, I mean, kind of connecting it back to like, I guess the Chicago's World Fair, or just like, I've kind of been taught is just like power imbalance. And I think it was mentioned in the article about the World's Fair that like a lot of what they were doing beyond just making fun and making them look stupid, like on top of that, it kind of like dehumanizes them. And so when like bad things happen, and like when like when bad things happen, it's like, well, like they're not really human, it's like killing okay, that's a horrible example, but like killing an animal. Yeah, like it's not as bad as killing an actual human, guys, but it's like, well, they are human, but like they were framed as less than. I don't know if that's just kind of my view. That's why someone would make fun of
That's
someone else.
absolutely correct. And historically speaking, in the times of the end of slavery in America, when the laws first changed, we sort of stopped slavery, right? It still took 2 years for that news to get across to Texas, hence the 1619 holiday of Juneteenth. And even then, those men weren't allowed to vote, neither were women. And when they finally started changing the laws to equalize things, one of the things that they did is to consider a Black man 3/5 of a white man in terms of humanity, humanness. And the original argument was that, you know, oh, these people aren't as quote unquote cultured, they aren't as quote unquote civilized, they aren't as educated, which may or may not have been true depending on the individual. But absolutely, the power structure, in order to maintain its power of the white people getting enough votes to keep their money in power, they wanted to make the Black people's votes 3/5 of a vote worth. So always that play on people's parody of another people is almost always about power. And nowadays it still goes on, but it's a lot more subtle. And I think that's both less offensive, hooray, but also it makes it more challenging to call it out appropriately and accurately, and a lot easier for people in power who are abusing their power to gaslight another group and say, oh, you're being too sensitive, or you don't understand, that was just a joke, or any of those things that people who are bullies or gaslighting do when they blame the other person or the other culture in abusive relationship for finding offense with what they're doing. If you're doing something and it offends the other person, they have every right to feel offended by it. And when someone says you shouldn't feel that way, it's always a good idea to like check that, because our feelings are our feelings and they're valid. Whether or not we act on them that's where there's choices to be made. But like, if someone's hurting your feelings because they're being a jerk, just because they think it's funny doesn't mean that you have to think it's funny, right? And so that's sort of, I feel like that's oftentimes the stumbling block in the conversation when we talk about race, and one group says this isn't cool anymore and the other group says whatever, you're taking it too hard. I don't want us to do that in this class. And with that, I think that covers the points I want to let percolate before we go deep into vaudeville. So we kind of are skipping a little bit forward here. Next week, we're going to start section C, which is about the economy and how people in America, especially African Americans, had to play with this double-edged sword of racism in order to get themselves out of the severe poverty that was inflicted upon them. And so we're going to see a lot more about white minstrelsy, but also Black minstrelsy, and how we flip the stereotypes. So I just wanted to steep these thoughts in before we do next week's readings. So that said, let's return to the fun part of this week, which is, yay, social dances. So this is going to focus on, we have some videos here touching on social dances that were happening in the early 20th century, so early 1900s. So especially the Charleston, the beginnings of tap dance, and we'll come back to all of these dances, but also swing and Lindy Hop. And the idea being that I wanted you to see, in connection to the earlier videos that we watched last week about breakdancing, the physical lineage of the social dance steps of things like the Charleston, and also all of the flipping that we saw that is evident in today's b-boying and in breakdancing. And that's sort of the through line that I'm drawing here, rather than going in a chronological order. And should we skip forward? This one's not. Let's skip forward to some crazier moves down here at the end. So you can see here that there are some elements we're going to talk about from the reading, such as the way that these dancers, does anybody here think these dancers are like not sweating? Right? They look like they're moving really fast and working pretty hard, yeah? But their faces are generally pretty serene. Like the level of their eyes and the stillness of their head is kind of cool. But their legs are absolutely vibrant, fast. And while their torsos are kind of doing this one even bounce, their feet are doing a different rhythm. Yeah? So we'll come back to those ideas in just a moment. Yes? And where's the other videos I saved for you? Come to that next. So just for the sake of our non-dancers, which I'm going to make you a try this. The Charleston. So I'll let you watch this for real in the future. But one of the things that's interesting about the Charleston, because it was a huge dance wave in the Americas and all over the world, is that it starts with, when you're learning it, you just learn this really basic forward and back step movement. But then the thing that makes it look like the Charleston, which, yes, it came from the city, Charleston, is that you start to twist the toes and knees while you're doing it, a la wing dancing. So let's see if I can get her to move on. So that action right there of knees in and out is definitely from the wing dancing that we saw that excerpt of before. And when you put them together, you end up with Charleston steps. So she's doing there's your basic Charleston step. It's just forward and back with the twisting of the legs. So we'll try that in the future. Yay, fun! And then let's get back to my list. All right. Trying to think, oh, how interesting that this came up, huh? Are you listening to me, YouTube? Yes, actually it is. So from there, let's have a little glance at this magic. Did you guys watch these? I always love it when you see female dancers lifting male dancers, because it's actually pretty gender bending in terms of what we traditionally expected out of dance. Like in ballet, the men always lift the women, and so every time there's a woman lifting a man, it makes me excited. So earlier you saw that this dance started out with people just surrounding a couple at a time dancing in the middle, which would be the shape we see in cypher dancing and breakdancing now, but also in the original community dances, where your audience was just your community that was dancing with you. And then towards the end here, you see this performing group, the Lindy Hoppers. They went into a formation of straight lines of couples, which plays more to the camera or to a stage.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is that the speed they actually dance, or is it dictated?
I think that is actually the speed of that dance.
Oh, wow.
I know, right? It's crazy. So just to kind of place that, so that film was 1941, and the film is Hell's a Poppin', but the people who are dancing in that scene are actually like a performance troupe that performed outside of the movie, as opposed to separate dancers hired for the sake of the movie. So those are Whitey's Lindy Hoppers. And in 1941, they would have been performing at places like the Savoy in New York City. So 41 is I want to say towards the end of Harlem Renaissance, which started with the Jazz Age. And you have this whole movement of African American it's considered what is the beginning of the civil rights movement, because basically all of these people who, after the Great Migration, when a bunch of people left the South, like seriously, a huge migration, people moved to the North and also to California, and a large movement of African-American people also came to New York City. And there was a great intellectual movement in New York City. And also jazz was transforming in the early 1920s from ragtime and Dixieland into what we think of as jazz, with improvisation and jazz clubs. And also at these jazz clubs, they had, of course, lots of dancing, because that's what you did for entertainment back then. And so this huge explosion of art and culture and philosophy, and a great big movement within the African-American community, which now has a bit of backlash. I don't want to get too far off track, but really a great movement encouraging African-Americans to both form their own culture and to gain education so that they could be gaining respect as members of society from the white people. And there's been back and forth in those philosophies about whether the African-American community really needs to gain respect by insulating itself or by integrating itself. And we'll get back to that later on. So I just want to throw that idea into the mix. But in New York City, we had all of these jazz clubs where not only were there African Americans playing the music and African Americans dancing in the Black clubs, but there were also clubs for the white people. Now, technically, we're not still segregated, but of course they still were, where there would be African American musicians, but white people listening. And then when the younger swing generation wanted to start to learn to dance, they would often the white young swing dancers would come and quote unquote slum it in Harlem. And so that filters back into vaudeville, because the white performers on the vaudeville stage, which we'll get to those, were actually training with the African-American and Black dancers in Harlem. So there's this weird secret crossover and mixing that's going on in this time. And we just want to take a moment before we get to showgirls and follies and all of that to show you where these dances came from authentically. And then we'll also look at where these dances turned up on white stages. And that's really how we end up with the idea of jazz dance on a white female body, which is often like, if you see jazz dance written down, then anyway, we'll get to that. Section D. So, do you guys have any questions about, and that's what this section here is talking about. Vernon and Irene Castle were a young couple in New York, and they came to New York, but they were also very prevalent in London, and the salon scene at the time involved people who would be ridiculously like Gadsby rich, and they would invite really famous performers to perform at their parties, because remember, there's just barely records to listen to and just barely radio to listen to at this time. So there was a lot more live music and live performance in everyday life, which would be great if we brought that back personally, I think. So these videos right here talk about how Vernon and Irene Castle, who were considered very classy upper class people, went out and learned dances that were popular with Black America, well, that some of them originated in Black America, but also that were popular in less than upper class communities. And they sort of mixed them together with the white ideology of posture, and showed them at these really fancy salons or parties and popularized them for the rest of high society, which then, of course, funded all of these nightclubs where the African-American people were performing as musicians, and those upper class people were also buying the tickets for things like vaudeville shows. Not early vaudeville, but later vaudeville. So that's my summary of this page. And now with that, I would like to bring you to some ballet. Okay, so this is an excerpt from George Balanchine's Apollo. Can I full screen it? And I'm showing you this because the article that we only read the first half of talks about George Balanchine in terms of Balanchine is originally from Eastern Europe, came to America, essentially built American ballet theater. But he also, as well as being a ballet master and choreography, he also did a lot of jazz. And so we'll look at some of his jazz work later on, but this tiny moment in one of his most famous ballets is being shown just to give you an idea visually of how, as Brenda Dixon Gottschild points out in the latter half of her article that you didn't read, how there are African elements that are spreading from African dance into concert dance of all kinds, including concert dance by white people. So we're going to next break down that article, which is kind of heavy reading. And I wanted to talk about some things that are jazzy in this for a hot second before we go on. So in regular ballet, we don't have so much abstraction. We don't have these tilted out hips. It's very not balletic. This off-centeredness was new to ballet. And so we don't spend time on the second half of the article, but we do spend time talking about Mr. Snake Hips Tucker. So the article by Dixon Gottschild is basically describing what she calls Africanist elements of dance from...
For you, Doctor, I wasn't looking for you, I'll guarantee you. I want to show you something. But, look.
And we have the white upper class framing of the African American performance, because it wasn't quite acceptable to just appreciate the African American performance without quote unquote framing it. So this is actually Mr. Snake Hips Tucker himself. I'm not sure if this is the exact video that she's referring to in the article. But you can see, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to stick your body around like that, but that is not easy. Super, super, super amount of strength here. Yeah. So last week we talked a little bit about the aesthetic of cool, and that is in the article you read, she refers back to that article we touched on last week about how he's just looking like everything's no big deal here, right? But he's got to be working so hard to move his body that serenely. Little Charleston step there. Like, how do you even do that? Oh, man.
I'll bet you that fella's mother was scared by a pretzel.
What? Wait, what? I don't know what that last line was. Did you guys hear it? I'm looking for a fun freeze frame. Scared by a pretzel? I don't know. Terrible, right? Again, with the white racist malarkey. Gross. So let's talk about the Africanist elements. Raise your hand if it all made sense to you.
You mean this dance?
The article. about the Africanist. Oh, yeah, please. Any reactions to the dance are totally welcome too.
I think in order to dance like him, you have to like feel every muscle of your body and to control it. It's like his whole body is moving, like every muscle. I think it's really hard to get to that point. It's a lot of work. It's crazy.
For sure. Yeah, I agree. So much physical work. And yet the whole time, he's just cool on top. We talked about effort, right, in the Laban elements section. And we talked about how something can look easy, look easy, but not be. And this is a great example of that. I mean, if you're going to really like release your knees and your hips all the way to their severe extreme bentness and yet still balance, that means all the other parts of your body have to squeeze to hold instead of them. So it's super difficult movement. And yet, when we think stereotypically about what we mean when we say something like technique, would you say that this man, I'm like, would we in parlance normally today say that this man had been technically trained or that he had studied dance technique?
I think so, right?
It's puzzling, right? I'm reading this really great article about this actually right now. Stereotypically, we would not say that this man had been quote unquote technically trained, but that is because of a white bias towards classical ballet training that we're now trying to get beyond and do better than. Obviously, this man has been dancing for more than 10 years, right? Like his skill level has definitely been developed for probably 20 years of him dancing every day. Yeah. But in the parlance of white dance training, in Western Eurocentric dance training, we used to say he hasn't been technically trained because technically trained was like code for ballet for the most part, or maybe ballet, maybe jazz and modern, maybe.
Oh yeah, but I think he definitely has technique because it doesn't come like in one night. You have to practice it all the time. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, what we call technique.
Yeah.
Like all elements that we practice and do well.
So I'm going to save this poll because we're kind of taking a different glance at this. So let's get to Brenda Dixon Gottschild. By the way, can I do that? No, send, cancel. How about this? Multiple attempts, 3. So you have 3 attempts on this next quiz. And because I know that this is kind of an academic deep dive quiz, you should take it 3 times because there are a lot of feedbacks in the questions. So if you get an answer wrong, then I really like explain why in this quiz. Yay! So I encourage you to take it more than once and go ahead and hit some wrong answers. And on that note, I want to make sure that we actually, this is the wrong direction, Amber, that we actually go into, I turned off the page I needed, sorry. This. Okay, so Brenda Dixon Gottschild. I just found this extra article of hers. So I'm going to watch that and see if that's a cool thing to share in the future. But she is an academic who writes about the Africanist presence in dance. And so she's kind of invented these terms that we're calling the Africanist elements. And they are ways in which we can identify echoes from African dances in current day art. Yeah. So, number 1, embracing the conflict. Yes. Number 2, polycentrism, polyrhythm. They don't have to be in order. High effect juxtaposition, ephebism, and everyone's favorite, the aesthetic of cool. So last week we read the article about the aesthetic of cool. She's definitely referring to that actual Thompson article. It's all embracing. It's the attitude of coolness that's composure and vitality at the same time, as opposed to the white Eurocentric version of cool, which is just like stoic and hard and organizes everything that's wild or crazy into restraint. So we were using a contrasting image of Ballet Blanc, for example, where it, like, those ballerinas in their white outfits, they do have a cool aesthetic usually, right? Like your face is very serene, or maybe it's smiling. You know, they're working so hard to balance on like one little toe, but it's cool, but it's also super controlled, right? Like all of them need to look exactly the same. Their arms need to be in exactly the same position, in exactly the same angle, in exactly the same formation in ballet. And that is playing to the Western Eurocentric aesthetic of liking things to be organized, logical, clean, reserved. That is a different kind of cool than the Africanist aesthetic of cool, which can be wild, crazy, sexually charged, viral, vibrant, and cool at the same time. So it's embracing the chaos. So that'll bring us back. I always feel like the aesthetic of the cool kind of rounds all of these back up together. So let's talk about, let's just go in order. Embracing the conflict. So as we were just saying, the African aesthetic embraces craziness at the same time as control. So rather than everybody in the room sitting perfectly still and listening to, here's kind of a good analogy. If you imagine a Puritan church where everybody is sitting in the pews being perfectly silent and listening to the preacher preach, that is different than in Baptist church where the preacher's preaching and the people in the pews are shouting back affirmations or heckling them, or I mean, they probably wouldn't be actually heckling, they'd probably be supportively heckling. But contrary being okay, and that you can well, she's using the example of that Tucker dance, that he had at the same time a disengaged, like, I don't care about you, and also menacing, like, I'm coming to get you attitude. I don't know. What do you guys think about embracing the conflict? Does that one make sense with all those examples we just gave?
I'm just kind of confused as to what like distinguishes it from the principal aesthetic of cool, because it seems very, very similar.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just kind of wondering, how do you discern between the two principles? Because like all the other ones seem to be pretty distinct from each other, except like, or at least for me, when
This
like
one's overlapping.
Oh,
right?
I see. Yeah, I was just wondering, like, is there like, how would I discern like an embracing conflict type of principle versus like an aesthetic of cool kind of principle?
Good question. I think that's what she's saying right here. Embracing the conflict is embedded in the aesthetic of cool. Yeah, so it's definitely part of it.
Mhm.
I think it's talking about, when we talk about the aesthetic of cool, we're talking about that layer of serenity or control that is put over the top. That's the aesthetic of cool. And embracing the conflict is the part where two different things are happening at the same time.
Oh, so it's like, wait, so I don't know if I'm getting this, but like, so aesthetic of cool is about like doing like something like chaotic, sexual and stuff like that, but having that calm expression, but like embracing the conflict is about like the act of doing it? Or
embracing the conflict is that the crazy part is going on. So here's maybe another counter. I don't know if this is a good example. When you think about Swan Lake, right? There we have like a ballet. It's definitely got ballet blanc in it, right? A bunch of identically moving, like in sync corps de ballet parts to it. But there's also the idea of the white swan and the black swan. Yes, even if you haven't seen it, you probably know this from pop culture, right? There's a white swan and a black swan. Black swan is the bad girl, and she, you know, takes the prince away from. I'm so oversimplifying this. I apologize. But in that version, there is opposition, right? There's two opposites, the black versus the white, right? And yet they're very controlled. They're very much like mirror images of each other in a certain way. Whereas embracing the conflict, you wouldn't have like the white version and the black version, or the red version and the blue version. You would have one totally extravagant thing over here and one totally extravagant thing over there. And that, so that even the chaos of opposition in white Eurocentric aesthetics is organized. Whereas embracing the conflict doesn't need to be organized. It can be cacophony. It can be multiple voices at once, as opposed to like, I'm obviously showing this one's good and this one's bad. Does that sort of make sense? Does that help a little bit clarify what the conflict part is?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and then the aesthetic of cool is like you do that, but have like the calm expression on top of like the act.
Yes. Ding, ding, ding. That's totally it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. See, this is why it helps to talk it out together. Okay. So embracing the conflict. We got it. Polycentrism and polyrhythm. So these are related because of the poly part. But we want to just clarify the two things. Polycentrism is when you're using different centers of movement or rhythm. So for example, if I were moving my head and then I was also moving my hand, right? This is two centers of movement. Yeah. And we don't really see that in Western Eurocentric dancing, except where it came from Africa, because of polyrhythm, which is in the dancing and the drumming that came from Africa. You have different drummers playing different rhythms at the same time. So if you think about, oh, I should totally have like a musical example right here. That's my homework. If you think about one person just clapping for, and another person, I'm not a drummer, doing a different rhythm at the same time. It would be great if I were a drummer right now. Yes, everybody. And having those two things happen together at the same time is something that comes from African music. And it also happens in Africanist dance. And the idea being that you might see that happen in a dance where one part of the body is doing one rhythm and one part of the body is doing another rhythm is polyrhythm or polycentrism in dance. And that is one of the things that Dixon Gottschild is saying it comes from Africa. Does that one make sense? Yes? I think that one's kind of accessible. So next one is hi. I'm going to move on. You can keep asking me questions. Oh, I see a chat popped up. Do, do, do. Yes, Crystal, that is true. Intense dance. Okay, so high effect juxtaposition. The important thing to think about this is the omission of transitions or connective links. Yeah. So in Western Eurocentric dance, we have, just like we were talking about the duality of black swan, white swan, we have comparative really different things as an element of beauty or an element of art. But the thing that makes it Africanist is when there's no explanation about the change from one thing to another, or more, no transition. Like, you might be dancing a really slow movement, as we were watching in that Snake Hips Tucker. He's like doing one of the little glidey sections where everything is really fluid and sliding around, and then all of a sudden this leg just like pops up out of nowhere, as though he's suddenly doing a can-can kick after doing that really windy thing. The lack of transition is part of the Africanist aesthetic, and also that is seen as a way to express comedy and irony. So remember, we were watching the help me out here, brain. I see it in my brain. The cakewalk dance, and we had those like we had the African dancers who were dressed in white Victorian finery doing buck and wing dances, and the way that they were or doing like really exaggerated, uplifted, prim walks that were not normal but exaggerated. That like right up against itself, two things that shouldn't make sense together, is a form of comedy, right? Because we know that they were making fun of the way that the upper class white people were acting by exaggerating their movement, and that is, it's funny to us because those two odd things are going together, as opposed to actually being really reserved. They're being exaggeratedly really reserved. And that comedy, that surprise element, is what's happening in high effect juxtaposition. Anybody want to ask me some great questions about that? Because that one's a little tricky too. I'm going to let you formulate some questions. Let me go through the last two. So ephebism, this one's pretty easy. Yeah, you want to go, Josh? I see you, but you're muted.
Oh yeah, no, I always keep forgetting. Wait, so does high effect juxtaposition, when trying to like isolate and determine that, does that have to only manifest in movement? How, like, can you refer to that when looking at like the performer's like attire too?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, because like I just noticed in the article, it talks about how like I think for one of his performances, maybe not the video, because I don't remember seeing like a seductive tassel or like a girl, because it says
she's talking about a different dance.
Yeah, because so like high effect juxtaposition is prevalent in like Snake Hips, like in this performance, because he has like kind of like an old lady girdle but has like this like seductive tassel.
Yeah.
Or I don't know. I mean, I think they said girdle, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so that's
like high effects juxtaposition is also a way to have double entendre. Do you guys know what that phrase is? I love this phrase. It means double meaning. So it's like when you say, oh, it's like when you text a eggplant emoji. It's got a double meaning, right? Or a peach emoji. Peach emoji also is a symbol now for buttocks because it looks like buttocks. But you could just be like, fruit salad, ha ha ha. And at the same time, you're pretending this, or you're on the surface, you're just presenting a vegetable or an innocent piece of fruit, but you're also juxtaposing that with an alternate meaning or innuendo of sexuality. So that's an example of high effect juxtaposition. And with the sense of the old lady girdle and the tassel is of course referring to man parts bouncing about as a double entendre. Yes? Such a weird conversation to have without you guys saying, okay! It's like just silence in the room. Oh my gosh, she's talking about what?
I like peach emoji, or is that what you mean?
I missed one word in your last sentence. Can you say that again?
Oh, I say like, is that like a peach emoji or something like that? Oh,
yeah,
okay.
A peach emoji. Yes, exactly. Double entendre. So in terms of the dance, she's talking about how there's like this childishness, but also this sexuality would be a high affect juxtaposition. Also, you could talk about, you know, effeminate versus macho movements, or very smooth with a sudden kick movement. Or if you're talking about music, you could use high effect juxtaposition to explain or to describe sampling in a song, right? You have one song that's going along with its melody, and then you like paste in this rap section, or vice versa. You have a song that's going along, and then there's a paste in of an aria. And that juxtaposition between, for example, one style of music or one style of movement with something that's very contrasting without any explanation from one thing to the other is the high effect juxtaposition. So in like a traditional white Eurocentric play or ballet, you might see two very different characters, but there'll be an explanation for it. Like, this is the bad guy, dun dun dun, and then the bad guy dance happens, and then it'll say, but here comes the good guy, dun dun dun, and then it'll be the good guy dance. Yeah. So the lack of framing and the just smashing it together and letting it be uncomfortable or funny is what makes it high effect in the high effect juxtaposition. Okay, ephebism. This one is pretty easy to understand. It just means super high energy youthfulness. Yeah, so old people dancing with high energy, speed, sharpness, force, affect, that virility, like out and out ferocious effort is pretty much what euphemism is. And it's also, so it doesn't have to be hard, but it's definitely like, when you look at that person, you just think, damn, they're in shape. They can really move. Yeah. And then we close with her talking about the aesthetic of school. Oh, good. She did use the Apollo. So down here, when she's talking about Apollo, that's the clip that we just saw. Not on Ballet Russe, but that's the same choreography. So, any questions about that? We'll keep talking about those Africanist elements, but my hope is that now that you've read that article and it'll sink in some more, we'll start to be able to use that when we're describing dances and things that we watch in the future. So, closing questions? I feel like we really focused on Africanist dance and talking about social dances this time, so I'm going to posit the poll that we took again later on and get back to it then, because I think we'll get to it later. Do you guys have any other questions or requests, or what are we doing next? What are we doing next? I think we finally get to economy. Yes. So next week, we're going to talk about Reconstruction era, which is what happened after the American Civil War ended, and we had this great forward movement where we, as a nation, tried for fixing the sins of slavery, and things got way better before they got way worse. Well, not way worse, but worse again. And we'll talk about the beginnings of tap and minstrelsy and how we went from that sideshow and early vaudeville format where shows were pretty small and traveling in little caravans, and they started to get on stages. And one of the upsides of vaudeville really getting into permanent stages or onto permanent stages more frequently is that it meant that performers were performing, for example, in New York City to really diverse audiences. And so that fact started to filter out some, but not all, but it slowly started to make the entertainment less racist, because a lot of those vaudeville jokes would be like, not just about Black people, but like they were just racist jokes all throughout it. So if you were performing to a crowd full of Italians and Irish people in New York City, whereas in Kansas, you weren't performing to that crowd. You started to have to change your jokes because that wouldn't go over very well if you're making fun of your audience. And of course, it took longer for that to change for the jokes about African people because they weren't in the audience because of segregation still going on. But it did start to happen there. And also vaudeville shows started to clean up the act in general, which is how we start to split off some of the sexual stuff in terms of when circuses went around, they often had peep shows and sex workers traveling with them. So that'll be, again, like in the next category. But first, we're going to talk about C, economy, and we're going to talk about how tapping and these performances were ways for people to break out of extreme poverty during Reconstruction and afterwards and before the Jazz Age. So we'll look at some tap dance. We have some tap videos. I'm trying to think. Sometime we're going to have a little try it yourself, probably next week or the week after. I'll invent one for you that will have some tap steps and some